Around 3 o'clock in the morning on a summer night in 1998, police officer David Davies and his sniffer dog Tyler were conducting a routine search in Darlington, England, when they discovered something disturbing in an abandoned garden, a bag containing decomposing human remains. What initially appeared to be the remains of a dead animal would reveal one of the most shocking stories in the quiet city of 100,000 inhabitants. Days later, police would confirm that the remains belonged to Julie Paterson, a 31-year-old mother of 4 who had disappeared a few weeks earlier. What no one could imagine was that her killer wasn't a stranger, but rather someone she had met in a local pub, David Harker, a 24-year-old aspiring musician who boasted to friends about his desire to become Britain's youngest serial killer. Stay until the end to understand how a night of drinking in a pub transformed into one of Darlington's most disturbing stories, involving cannibalism, a killer who called himself the Devil Man, and a series of tragic events that would affect 3 different families and forever change how residents viewed their city. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe now and activate the bell to not miss other cases like this one. David Harker's early years already signaled the monster he would become. Raised in Teesside, an industrial region in northeastern England, his youth was marked by violent incidents that left local authorities on alert. From early on, he demonstrated a morbid fascination with violence and an insatiable desire to shock those around him. At 16, Harker committed his first documented violent crime, a brutal attack against 2 men and their dog. The nature of the attack was particularly disturbing, as there was no apparent motive beyond the pleasure Harker seemed to feel in inflicting pain. This incident resulted in his first stint in a young offenders institution, where staff noted his manipulative behavior and his ability to alternate between charm and aggression as it suited him. During his stay at the institution, Harker began to develop what would later become his trademark, an obsession with serial killers, particularly Jeffrey Dahmer. He spent hours reading about serial killers and shared with other inmates his fantasies about becoming Britain's youngest serial killer. The institution's psychologists noticed his tendency to glorify violence and his complete lack of empathy for victims. When he turned 18, Harker decided he needed a fresh start. He chose Darlington, a quiet city of 100,000 inhabitants, known for its railway history and united community. The choice wasn't random. He knew that a smaller city, where people tended to be more trusting and less suspicious, would be the perfect environment to cultivate his manipulative personality. The move to Darlington represented, in the community's eyes, a story of redemption. A troubled young man seeking a second chance. No one could imagine that, behind this facade of repentance and desire for change, Harker was merely looking for a new hunting ground where he could fulfill his darkest fantasies away from the watchful eyes of those who knew his past. In Darlington, David Harker proved to be a master of manipulation. Arriving as a 23-year-old seeking redemption, he quickly built an image of a polite and charismatic young man. With his imposing height of 6 feet and 3 inches and initially common appearance, Harker presented himself as someone who had left his problems behind, winning the trust of local residents with his studied cordiality. His ability to adapt was remarkable. In the city's pubs, he was known as a pleasant companion, always willing to buy a round of drinks. In the apartments where he lived, neighbors described him as an exemplary tenant, always ready to help. This ability to socially camouflage himself was his most effective weapon. The more people lowered their guards, the easier it became for him to identify potential vulnerable victims. However, as he felt more secure in his new environment, Harker began to let his true nature emerge. He joined a local punk band, not so much for musical interest, but for the opportunity to construct a new persona. It was during this period that his outer transformation began to reflect his inner darkness. The tattoos he chose for his head weren't mere declarations of rebellion. Subhuman on one side and disorder on the other were manifestos of his true intentions. The final metamorphosis came when he began to declare himself the Devil Man. In the same pubs where he once charmed with his charisma, he now climbed on tables, shouting that he would rot in hell. What many interpreted as theatrical performance or the result of drinking was, in fact, Harker testing society's limits, provoking reactions, and, more disturbingly, announcing his criminal intentions so openly that no one took them seriously. This duality, The polite young man who helped neighbors during the day and the self-proclaimed devil man who frightened people at night wasn't a contradiction, but rather two sides of the same coin. Harker had perfected the art of existing in two worlds simultaneously, using his daytime respectability as cover for his darker tendencies. The Darlington community, in its provincial innocence, was about to discover in the most brutal way that they had welcomed a predator into their midst. Before becoming a headline in newspapers as a victim of a brutal crime, Julie Paterson was a 31-year-old woman struggling to rebuild her life. Born in Durham, her childhood was marked by the premature loss of her mother when she was just 3 years old, a tragedy that would echo in her own battles with motherhood years later. Those who knew her described Julie as someone who just wanted to be loved and have stability in her life. As a mother of 4 children, Julie dedicated herself intensely to motherhood, despite the difficulties she faced. Her brother Michael remembered her as a cheerful person in her best moments, always willing to help others. However, life had other plans for Julie. In a succession of devastating blows, she lost custody of her 3 older children, an experience that left her emotionally fragile. The relationship with Alan Taylor seemed to offer Julie the chance for stability she so desperately sought. Alan was completely dedicated to her, and together they had a child. It was a relationship marked by typical ups and downs of any couple, but also by moments of true happiness. They dreamed of moving to the coast, where they could start over away from the problems that haunted them in Darlington. However, the pregnancy with her 4th child, instead of bringing joy, culminated in another devastating loss. The baby was put up for adoption, a decision whose exact circumstances remained nebulous, but which plunged Julie into a deep depression. To cope with the pain, she began to depend on Valium and alcohol, developing a pattern of behavior that worried those who loved her. Julie occasionally disappeared for a few days, a behavior that became so common that not even her partner Alan was immediately alarmed by her absences. She would simply leave, sometimes for a day, sometimes for up to 3 days, always eventually returning. This routine of temporary disappearances would, tragically, be what delayed the discovery of her final disappearance. When she met David Harker in a local pub, no one imagined that this time she wouldn't return home. On a night in April 1998, Julie Paterson met David Harker in a local Darlington pub. To the establishment's patrons, it seemed just another casual encounter between 2 acquaintances. He, the charismatic young man everyone knew from the city's bars. She, a vulnerable woman seeking company after another difficult period in her life. Harker, using his well-known manipulative skills, convinced Julie to accompany him to his apartment. The location, which would later be described by police as a scene straight out of The Silence of the Lambs, was situated in a quiet residential area of the city. What happened in the following hours would reveal the true nature of the man who called himself the Devil Man. During subsequent investigations, the macabre details emerged through Harker's own confessions. After having consensual sex with Julie, he found a pair of socks near the bed. It was at this moment that his homicidal impulse manifested. Using the socks as a strangling instrument, he took Julie's life. But the horror was far from over. What distinguished this crime from a simple homicide were Harker's subsequent actions. He kept the body in his apartment's basement for approximately 2 weeks, during which he committed acts of desecration that would shock even the most experienced investigators. In his later confessions, Harker claimed to have practiced cannibalism, stating that he cut flesh from Julie's thigh and prepared it with pasta and garlic, an allegation that police could never fully confirm, but which demonstrated the level of his depravity. In the following weeks, Harker methodically dismembered Julie's body, separating arms, legs, and head from the torso. The torso was placed in a garbage bag and discarded in an abandoned garden on Poland Lane, where it would later be discovered thanks to police dog Tyler's keen sense of smell. The other body parts, including the head, were never found, a mystery that would haunt families and investigators for years to come. Throughout this period, Harker continued his normal routine, frequenting the same pubs where he used to drink. More disturbing still, he began to brag about the murder to his young friends, describing details of the crime with morbid pleasure. However, due to his reputation as a storyteller and his tendency to make shocking statements to attract attention, no one initially took his confession seriously. Harker's apartment held irrefutable evidence of the crime. Police found significant bloodstains in the bedroom, consistent with the dismemberment of the body. In the corner of the room, there were disturbing poems and writings, including references to Pantera's song Becoming, which Harker frequently cited, talking about being reborn with snake eyes and becoming God. On the bedroom wall, a single word was written, the same word that would be found on a knife recovered later in the garage, where a blood-stained blanket was discovered inside a plastic container. In the kitchen, investigators found household utensils that had been used in the dismemberment process, a discovery that emphasized the premeditated and calculating nature of the crime. What made this case particularly disturbing for the Darlington community wasn't just the brutality of the crime itself, but the revelation that such a sophisticated predator had lived among them, hidden behind a facade of normality. Harker wasn't a stranger who emerged from the shadows to attack. He was someone the community had welcomed, someone who drank in the same pubs, walked the same streets, and, all this time, planned to fulfill his darkest fantasies. The discovery that would forever change the city of Darlington began with a routine search. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, police officer David Davies and his sniffer dog Tyler were patrolling Poland Lane, a quiet area of the city, searching for an unrelated missing person. Tyler, a German shepherd trained to detect human traces, suddenly changed his behavior. His nose rose to the wind, and he began barking insistently near a fence. The scene that followed seemed straight out of a nightmare. Upon closer investigation, Davies found a bag that, according to an elderly local resident, had been there for a few weeks and supposedly contained a dead dog. The smell of decomposition was unmistakable. With the arrival of daylight, the true nature of the discovery was revealed. Human shoulder blades were clearly visible through the bag material. The news spread through the city like an uncontrolled fire. Darlington, an old Quaker railway town with just over 100,000 inhabitants, wasn't prepared to handle a crime of this magnitude. Residents began locking their doors, looking over their shoulders, and questioning every familiar face. The city that was previously known for its tranquility now found itself at the center of a horror story. The identification of the remains as being Julie Paterson's triggered one of the largest police operations ever seen in the region. More than 800 lines of investigation were opened, and more than 200 witnesses were heard. The city transformed into a media circus, with journalists from across the country converging to cover what was being called the cannibal murder. The impact on the community was profound and immediate. Local pubs, previously places of carefree meeting and socializing, became points of nervous discussion about the crime. Neighbors who previously barely exchanged greetings now gathered to share theories and fears. The discovery that only the torso had been found, with the head, arms, and legs still missing, fed residents' worst nightmares. For families living near the discovery site, the reality was even more disturbing. An elderly lady had inadvertently lived with the remains in her garden for weeks, believing the story about the dead dog. This revelation exemplified how evil can hide in plain sight, disguised by the very normality of daily life. The case exposed an uncomfortable truth about life in small towns, the false sense of security that comes from familiarity. As a local newspaper observed at the time, "This isn't Merseyside, this isn't Tyneside, this is our town." The idea that such a brutal killer could live and move freely among them shook the very foundations of the community. But the true horror was yet to come. As investigators began to piece together the puzzle, they discovered that the killer wasn't a stranger who had infiltrated the city. He was someone everyone knew, someone who had drunk in the same pubs, walked the same streets, and gained the trust of dozens of local residents. The realization that David Harker had been among them all along transformed fear into something even deeper, an irreparable loss of Darlington's collective innocence. It was an anonymous call that finally broke the case. One of Harker's young friends, after a night of drinking, could no longer bear the weight of the secret. For this young person, the realization that Harker's fanciful stories were real came through an edition of the Northern Echo, where Julie's photo was on the front page. The investigation took a new turn when detectives began interviewing Harker's social circle. A disturbing pattern emerged. He had told more than 20 different people about the murder, always mixing true details with references to horror movies and famous serial killer stories. His particular obsession was Jeffrey Dahmer, the infamous American cannibal killer. When investigators arrived at Harker's apartment in Darlington, they found a scene that surpassed their worst expectations. Beyond the physical evidence of the crime, there was a disturbing collection of writings on the walls. Among poems and manifestos, Harker had documented his transformation into something greater than human, a reference to Pantera's song Becoming, which he frequently cited as his inspiration. In the apartment's garage, a particularly macabre discovery awaited investigators. A knife with specific inscriptions and a blood-stained blanket carefully folded inside a plastic container. Forensic analysis would later reveal that the blood belonged to Julie, and the marks on the knife corresponded to the cuts found on her remains. Harker's interrogation revealed a calculating mind that had planned not just the murder, but also his own notoriety. During interviews, he alternated between moments of apparent cooperation and explosions of controlled fury. In a particularly revealing moment, when questioned about the missing body parts, he responded with a smile. Some secrets need to remain buried. The search for the missing body parts became one of the largest operations of its kind in Durham's history. 50 police officers were assigned to search the local landfill, turning over more than 20,000 tons of garbage. Harker watched the efforts with apparent satisfaction, occasionally sending enigmatic clues in the form of poems to the police, all leading to dead ends. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation was the discovery of a detailed diary where Harker documented his violent fantasies. The document revealed that Julie's murder wasn't an impulsive act, but the culmination of years of planning. He had meticulously studied the behavior patterns of known serial killers, adapting their techniques to maximize not just the crime's impact, but also his own infamy. For the most experienced investigators, the Harker case represented something unique. A killer who didn't just want to kill, but wanted his story to be told. Every aspect of the crime, from the choice of victim to the method of body disposal, had been choreographed to ensure maximum media attention. In his own words, written on his apartment walls, "Death is just the beginning of fame." David Harker's trial surprised the British judicial system with its peculiarity. Instead of facing a murder charge, he was indicted for manslaughter based on diminished responsibility, a decision that initially shocked the community. The psychiatrist who examined him classified him among the 4% most disturbed individuals in Great Britain, an assessment that significantly influenced the legal process. During the hearings, Harker maintained a demeanor that disconcerted even the most experienced court professionals. While the prosecution presented grotesque evidence of his crimes, he remained impassive, occasionally smiling when particularly disturbing details were mentioned. His only display of emotion came when Pantera's Becoming lyrics were presented, which he considered his personal manifesto. Judge Bennett, in delivering the sentence, declared Harker a bad and exceptionally dangerous man, sentencing him to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he not be considered for parole before serving at least 14 years. But the sentence was far from bringing closure to this tragic story. The most devastating impact was on Alan Taylor, Julie's partner. Consumed by grief and frustration of never having a proper burial for his loved one, Alan spiraled into alcoholism and depression. The obsessive search for Julie's missing body parts became his only reason to live. He was frequently seen wandering through Darlington's parks with a shovel, digging holes in hopes of finding some trace. 7 years after Julie's murder, the tragedy gained a new dark chapter. Alan Taylor, still tormented by the loss, murdered his friend John Morrison after a drinking session. The crime shocked the community not just for its violence, but for its revealed motivation. Taylor told police he wanted to be sent to Wakefield Prison, where Harker was detained, to settle unfinished business. The final outcome of this chain of tragedies came when Alan Taylor took his own life in prison, leaving a suicide note mentioning Julie and his desire to finally find peace. His death represented the third life destroyed as a direct consequence of Harker's actions. Meanwhile, in Wakefield Maximum Security Prison, Harker seemed to have achieved exactly what he always wanted: notoriety. He refused to receive visits and maintained a calculated silence about the whereabouts of Julie's remains, transforming his secret into a form of power over the victims' families. His only communications with the outside world were through enigmatic letters sent to the Northern Echo, where he continued to taunt investigators and family members with false clues. The case permanently altered investigation protocols in Darlington. The local police, who initially hesitated to investigate Julie's disappearance due to her previous disappearances, completely reformulated their procedures for missing persons. The initial delay in the investigation, which gave Harker precious time to conceal evidence, became a case study on the importance of taking all disappearances seriously, regardless of the person's history. 25 years later, the Harker case continues to shape Darlington's collective psyche. Homeowners still hesitate before digging in their gardens, fearing macabre discoveries. Real estate agents avoid mentioning certain properties on Poland Lane, where some apartments remain empty, carrying the silent stigma of the crime. The community developed its own rituals to deal with the trauma. Every year, on the anniversary of Julie's disappearance, flowers mysteriously appear at the location where her torso was found. No one knows who places them there. It's as if the entire city participates in a silent pact of remembrance. The impact on police practices was lasting. The Durham Police Department now uses the Harker case in its training, emphasizing how killers can camouflage themselves in small communities and the importance of taking apparently fantastical reports seriously. A specific section of the training addresses the phenomenon of criminals who announced their crimes in advance, something Harker did repeatedly. In local schools, Harker's name became a kind of urban legend, whispered in corridors by teenagers who were small children or hadn't been born when the crime occurred. Teachers report that they frequently need to correct distorted versions of the story, balancing the need to preserve Julie's memory with care not to glamorize her killer. Michael Paterson, Julie's brother, transformed his pain into action. He established a foundation that works with vulnerable women in Darlington, offering support and counseling. The project, which operates discreetly to protect its participants' privacy, has already helped hundreds of women escape potentially dangerous situations. In Wakefield Maximum Security Prison, Harker developed a peculiar reputation among the staff. He keeps his cell meticulously organized, spends hours writing in notebooks that no one is permitted to read, and occasionally requests books about human anatomy, requests that are systematically denied. His only interaction with the outside world is through enigmatic letters he occasionally sends to the Northern Echo, each containing coded clues about Julie's remains that invariably lead nowhere. In 2018, 20 years after the crime, Chief Superintendent David Jones, about to retire, made one last attempt to get answers. He visited Harker in prison, hoping that 2 decades of reflection might have changed him. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. Harker kept his eyes fixed on a distant point on the wall and only spoke once, to say, "Some stories don't have an ending." Prison guards report that Harker maintains a peculiar ritual. Every night, before sleeping, he walks exactly 9 steps in his cell, the same number of parts into which he divided Julie's body. It's as if, even after 2 decades, he continues reliving his crime, transforming it into a kind of macabre dance. The case fundamentally changed how Darlington sees itself. The city that once prided itself on being a place where everybody knows everybody now carries a darker wisdom. Residents learned that familiarity isn't the same as knowledge, and that the most dangerous monsters are often those who know how to blend in. For the new generation of police officers in Darlington, the Harker case has become a kind of final test. Every rookie inevitably ends up involved in some new search related to the case, whether investigating an anonymous tip or checking a previously unexplored area. It's as if the city couldn't really move forward until the last chapter of this story is written. In 2024, Harker continues to be Wakefield's most notorious prisoner, not for the quantity of his victims, but for the calculating nature of his single crime and his refusal to provide closure. While other killers eventually show remorse or try to bargain information for privileges, Harker seems to savor his role as keeper of a secret that continues to haunt an entire city. If this story impacted you as much as it impacted the city of Darlington, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Each subscription helps us continue telling stories that, however difficult they may be, need to be remembered. Until the next story.